Good evening, everyone. I am deeply honored to have Aaron Maté with us this evening. First time on the channel. Some of you may have seen him deconstructing the Russiagate propaganda perpetuated by the Clinton crime family. Some of you may have seen him recently on Piers Morgan debating Israel, Palestine, and he's also been talking about Russia and Ukraine, and we're going to get to all of that. If you've got any questions for him, put them in the chat. We've got loads of questions come in on YouTube and Twitter, and we will get those to him. So first off, thank you for coming on, man.
Thanks for having me, Sean. Good to be here.
Yeah, we salute your work. And, I've got a 1-year-old baby here. I was listening to Scott Ritter this morning, and he was saying UK was very close to getting bombed in the last 24 hours because of this long-range missile stuff that Keir Starmer and Boris Johnson are pushing against Russia. I'd like to start out with your perspective on that, please.
Well, this is the result of a U.S.-led policy of fighting Russia to the last Ukrainian, rejecting so many opportunities for peace, both well before Russia invaded and afterward, too. We can talk more about that if you wish. There's plenty to discuss. And when your goal is not to defend Ukraine, but to use it to bleed Russia, you're inevitably going to put yourself in a situation like this, where now Ukraine's running out of manpower. It's losing territory in the key battleground area, which is the Donbass. That's the territory that Russia is really concerned with, because that's where millions of people live that want to speak Russian and identify as ethnic Russian. And for 10 years since a U.S.-backed coup, they've had their rights trampled on. So that's where Russia is focused on. So as Ukraine continues to lose ground, they're growing increasingly desperate. And Zelensky laid out what his strategy is the other day in an interview with CNN's Fareed Zakaria in terms of what his plan is for victory. And basically he said, we want to make the Russian people suffer so that they turn against Vladimir Putin. That if they really, really suffer enough, if they go without energy, if they go without, just having a normal life, if their lives are disrupted, then they'll put enough pressure on Putin to end the war. That's Zelensky's genius strategy. And this has been basically the strategy of U.S. neocons for a long time now. They really think that if they put enough pressure on Russia via sanctions and now via proxy war, the people of Russia will rise up against Putin. Hasn't worked out. I mean, putting aside whether we have the right to seek regime change anywhere, just tactically, it has not worked out. But that's the position Zelensky is in because he's gone along with the U.S. goal of using his country to bleed Russia. So now they're so desperate that they want permission from the ultimate boss here, which is Joe Biden, to launch these long-range strikes with U.S. weapons into Russia. And they think that somehow that can turn the tide. And Keir Starmer is apparently on board with that. Now, I don't know if that's Keir Starmer acting on his own volition or if he's been put up to this by, people he allies with in Washington, like people like Antony Blinken, who really want something like this. I don't know. I'd have to know more about Keir Starmer's psychology. But he's certainly the public face of this proposal. He wants to have long-range strikes with Western weapons into Russia. But the problem is, it looked like actually this was going to be approved. Antony Blinken certainly suggested that it was going to happen. And some European officials leaked to the New York Times and other places that Biden was going to approve this. But then Vladimir Putin spoke up. He said, listen, if Biden approves this, then these NATO states involved in this will be at war with Russia, and there will be consequences. And according to reports, that spooked people inside the Pentagon and U.S. intelligence agencies, because they're the ones that actually have to carry out the policies that Joe Biden and Antony Blinken sign off on. And they recognize that they don't want to have a direct confrontation with Russia, which this policy that Zelensky is pushing for is threatening. And so I think what happened was they got to Biden, warned him about the consequences. And Biden looked very agitated at the White House on Friday when he met with Keir Starmer. He snapped at reporters, asked him questions about this. But ultimately, I think he's backed off, at least for now. And Zelensky is left holding the bag because he's the one who's put himself in this position. And it's just sad. There's so many reasonable opportunities to avoid all of this. And again, it was recognized for a very long time that two things. One, that militarily, if you engage in a war with Russia, if you're Ukraine, you're going to lose. Antony Blinken said this back in March 2015. He said that if you're playing to the military strategy against Russia, then Ukraine will be at a disadvantage simply because of Russia's proximity to Ukraine and its size. It's just so much bigger than Ukraine. And so whatever Ukraine does militarily, Russia can do much worse. Antony Blinken said that in March 2015. You can look it up. And of course, that was when he was implementing a different policy. Now he's implementing the exact opposite policy. And Zelensky, back in March of 2022, right as peace negotiations were going on between the two sides, he said that there are people in the West who do not want to see this war end, who want to see Ukraine basically be sacrificed for war against Russia. And he was saying this right as progress was being made between Ukrainian and Russian negotiators to reach a peace deal. And we know what happened next. A few weeks after Zelensky said that, Boris Johnson came to Kyiv, told Zelensky on behalf of the U.S., don't make a peace deal with Russia. If you do, we're not going to back you up. And given the centrality of the U.S. in Ukraine since the 2014 coup, Zelensky could not make a peace deal without Washington's blessing. And as part of that peace deal, he wanted security guarantees from the U.S. and U.K. to underpin the deal. And this was Boris Johnson telling Zelensky, sorry, we're not going to give you these security guarantees. We're going to instead basically encourage you to keep fighting Russia. And we think you have a strong chance of success. And rather than stand up to them and stand up to the ultra-nationalists inside his own country that also do not want peace with Russia, Zelensky decided to continue the war. And here we are today.
And look at how many people have died since Boris Johnson intervened. There was a report yesterday that Boris Johnson was out there meeting people who had injuries and stuff and blaming the evil of Putin. And it reminds me of Griselda Blanca, the cartel woman. She would assassinate whole families and then she would go to the funerals and cry the loudest. I mean, how psychopathic and evil are these people?
Well, they certainly have an obsession with weakening Russia, and they have contempt accordingly for Ukrainian lives. Because if you cared about Ukraine's well-being, why would you encourage it at every single turn to sacrifice itself for a proxy war against Russia? Which, by the way, Boris Johnson and Joe Biden don't want to fight themselves. They don't want to send their own troops off to go fight against Russia, but they're happy to sacrifice Ukrainians for it. And unfortunately, inside Ukraine, there's a minority of ultra-nationalists who align with their goals, because these people, as they've made clear since 2014, hate the ethnic Russian component of Ukraine, have contempt for them, and don't want to recognize these ethnic Russians of Ukraine, the ones that primarily live in the East, as equal. That's why one of the first moves after coming to power in a US-backed coup in 2014 was to basically try to ban the Russian language, or basically not allow it to be made an official language of the state, to downgrade it. And there have been plenty of other things that have been done against them. Also renaming Ukrainian streets after literal Ukrainian Nazis who massacred, Jews and Poles back in the Second World War. So these are all steps that have been taken to marginalize ethnic Russians of Ukraine. People want to have ties with Russia. And unfortunately for Ukraine, I think they found allies in Washington who see this goal of fighting against Russia and Ukraine as a part of their broader strategy. And Boris Johnson has been an exponent of that. And it's been a disaster for Ukraine. How anyone who cares about Ukraine's long-term well-being can support these policies is really beyond me. It doesn't exonerate Russia for invading Ukraine. I wish Russia could have found a different way to address the serious issues that Ukraine posed. I don't think war was its only option. I think to justify invading a country, you have to show there was no other options whatsoever. I'm open to Russia making that case that, if they not acted, there would have been, massive atrocities carried out by Ukraine in the Donbass, which they were threatening to invade. So I'm open to that case, but I don't think that they've convincingly made it. And I think when you invade a country, you have to show that you've exhausted all nonviolent means first. And I don't think Russia's made that case. But that doesn't mean, and this is especially important for Western citizens, because we're responsible for what our governments do, not what Vladimir Putin does, that we did not play a major role in both provoking this war and prolonging it when there was reasonable opportunities to end it, namely in those peace talks I mentioned that happened immediately after Russia invaded in early 2022.
So just to go back to some basics then, the mainstream media narrative here in the UK is that Russia has invaded a sovereign nation, Ukraine, out of the clear blue. It's just an evil aggrandizement. What is the backstory?
Well, there's a very long backstory, starting with the collapse of the Soviet Union. There was a verbal promise made to Gorbachev that NATO would not expand 1 inch to the east. Now, historians disagree over what that promise really meant. Some people say that all they were promising is that NATO wouldn't put troops in the parts of Germany that were going to be reunified to form a united Germany, rather than speaking to other countries that were in NATO. But regardless, there was understanding that with the collapse of the Soviet Union, NATO certainly would not be expanding up to Russia's doorstep. But unfortunately, in the years that followed, the US led the way in pushing NATO, a hostile military alliance, to Russia's door. And in 2008, George W. Bush, against the advice even of some of his own aides, including Fiona Hill, decides to promise future membership to Ukraine. And people are warning at the time that this is a disaster. William Burns, who's now the director of the CIA for Joe Biden, back then he was the U.S. ambassador to Russia. He sent a very famous cable titled "Niet Means Niet." And it talked about how across the political spectrum in Russia, NATO for Ukraine is a red line, because as Russians, from Vladimir Putin to even people who hate Vladimir Putin, recognized that if there was an internal conflict in Ukraine between the people who identify with Russia and want to speak Russian, want ties with Russia, and the ultranationalists over something like NATO, then Russia would feel forced to intervene, because there are millions of people inside Ukraine who identify with Russia and consider themselves to be Russian. And Russia was not going to let them be slaughtered. So that's why having Ukraine in a hostile military alliance would be suicidal. The answer, when you have a very divided country like Ukraine, is to respect its divisions and to just keep it neutral, which was, by the way, the goal enshrined in Ukraine's Declaration of State Sovereignty in 1991. So this was not some radical Russian demand. This actually starts with Ukraine's own foundation as a modern state at the end of the Soviet Union. And by the way, it was also the opinion of a majority of Ukrainians at this time. If you look at poll after poll from that period, a vast majority of Ukrainians did not want to join NATO. But this was basically pushed by people like George W. Bush, Dick Cheney, and a small minority inside of Ukraine. So fast forward to 2014, you have Viktor Yanukovych, who is elected on a platform where he wants to further integrate into Europe. He wants to have a trade deal with the European Union, but militarily, he wants to keep Ukraine neutral, as its Declaration of State Sovereignty called for. And that, for Washington, is a no-no. That they want someone who will not be neutral, but actually will further George W. Bush's goal of Ukraine joining NATO. So the U.S. backs a coup in which Yanukovych is overthrown. And this starts out as a protest movement, largely nonviolent against Yanukovych, against his corruption and calling for better ties with the EU. But by the end of it, the protests have basically morphed into a call for insurrection led by fascists, led by people like the Svoboda Party, which 1 year prior, the European Parliament had condemned for being anti-Semitic, racist, and xenophobic. And these are the people now at the heart of the Maidan movement. And they're the ones who are instrumental in rejecting a deal that is brokered by the EU and Russia and the US that would keep Yanukovych in power, but have early elections and actually have a coalition government. It's the Maidan leaders, the fascist Maidan leaders, that reject this, and they basically, a series of events happen, and Yanukovych flees, and they push through, without a parliamentary quorum, a new government. And what is the new government's first step, or one of them, is to basically try to ban the Russian language, as I mentioned before. So people in the East who voted for Yanukovych, who saw him as their leader, they launch a revolt with Russia's help, and you have a war break out in the Donbass, which is the eastern part of Ukraine, where millions of ethnic Russians live. And what does the U.S. do? Well, John Brennan travels to Kyiv in April of 2014. This is shortly after Russia has taken Crimea, and Russia does that because now you have a new coup government inside Ukraine that is wanting to join NATO, and Russia is faced with the loss of its most important naval base in Crimea. So Russia seizes Crimea, by the way, with the support of a majority of Crimean residents. Forget the referendum that happened, which people have challenged as not being legitimate. But if you look at U.S. government-funded polls, a majority of Crimeans said that after the coup, in which their government in Kyiv was overthrown, they wanted to join Russia. So John Brennan travels to Kyiv and tells the new government that he helped install in backing the coup, that you should launch an operation in the Donbass. I recently reported this based on the firsthand testimony of somebody who was in that meeting, a Ukrainian official at the time, who witnessed John Brennan telling Kyiv, you should launch an operation to basically take back the Donbass from this Russian-backed rebellion, and we'll back you up. So then you have a war breakout. And then but then unfortunately for Ukraine, they suffer some major losses, which forces them to reach something called the Minsk Accords. And the basic premise of the Minsk Accords is that Ukraine will recognize some limited autonomy for the Donbass. They'll get to elect their own judges. They'll get to have more of a say in running their own affairs. And in exchange, the rebels will lay down their arms, and all foreign forces, including Russians, will withdraw. But we know what happened. Whenever the Ukrainian government, starting with Poroshenko, the leader of Ukraine at the time who negotiated this, whenever he takes steps to try to implement Minsk, to try to grant some limited autonomy to the Donbass, to start having a dialogue with the rebel leaders, as Minsk called for, ultra-nationalists, the same people who led the Maidan coup, have violent protests, including one in August 2015, where state forces were killed and shot at by these ultra-nationalists, saying that we cannot have any sort of peace agreement with these traitors in the East, because they don't see these people in Eastern Ukraine who identify with Russia as being equal Ukrainians. They have an ultra-nationalist conception of what Ukraine is, which does not include Russians. And they include people like the Azov Battalion, which is a neo-Nazi paramilitary formation. So that's who leads the charge against the Minsk Accords. And fast forward a little bit to Zelensky. He gets elected on a peace platform. He says, I'm going to make peace. I'm going to make peace with the people in the Donbass. We're going to have peace in this country. I'm going to fight corruption. And that's an exciting time for a lot of Ukrainians, because he doesn't represent the traditional political factions inside Ukraine. So there's real hope that this political outsider can actually make peace. And Zelensky, again, does do some concrete steps to implement Minsk. But once again, he faces massive protests from the ultra-nationalists or the fascists or neo-Nazis, like whatever you want to call them. There's a major one just as he's meeting with Vladimir Putin in December. This would be December 2019. And the slogan is no to capitulation. People carrying torches, neo-Nazis, people who worship Bandera, who is a neo-Nazi collaborator back during the Second World War. And unfortunately for Zelensky, these ultra-nationalists have the support of a really powerful constituency, which is neocons in Washington from both parties, who don't want to see a peace deal, who want to use Ukraine for their goal to bleed Russia. And this continues up when Joe Biden comes to power. He encourages Zelensky to crack down on the opposition. So one of Zelensky's first moves after Biden takes office is he bans the television network of Ukraine's largest opposition party, which is led by a guy named Medvedchuk, who happens to be very close to Vladimir Putin. And Putin sees this as yet another sign that Ukraine is not interested in recognizing the rights of Ukrainians who want to live in peace with Russia. And this culminates in, all the steps we saw before the invasion. And right before the invasion of February 2022, Zelensky's government makes clear they're not going to implement Minsk. All those officials say it. Basically, we're not going to implement Minsk on what they say are Russia's terms. And what they mean by Russia's terms are the terms that were negotiated back in 2015. So that's what I'm talking about when I say that there were so many opportunities to avoid this invasion. And by the way, what else happens in the weeks leading up to Russia's invasion? On top of Ukrainian officials saying we're not going to implement Minsk, you also have an increase in artillery fire coming from the Ukrainian government side of the demarcation line into the Donbass side. And military people will tell you, when you have a huge surge in artillery fire, that's an indication that Ukraine is preparing to actually invade the Donbass. Now, it's a counterfactual now. Were they actually doing that? Were they just launching these strikes? I don't know. For some other reason, we'll never know. But Russia takes all these signs as an indication that Ukraine does not want to make peace, does not want to implement the Minsk Accords, and is even possibly preparing a military operation to retake the Donbass by force. And that, plus the U.S. refusing to negotiate with Russia on its major security demands, including limiting missile deployments in Europe that surround Russia, all this leads to a situation where Putin decides to invade Ukraine, and here we are today.
All right, so viewers, if you've got a question, put them in the chat. We've got a question that's come in on Twitter here from Raul Duke. Do you believe that the strategic partnership as ex-military nuclear technology between Russia, Iran, and China is enough to work as a deterrent for US-UK in Ukraine?
In Ukraine, is it enough to work as a deterrent in Ukraine?
For US and UK in Ukraine, to deter US and UK in Ukraine?
Well, again, look, the deterrent to World War III in Ukraine is that the US does not want to fight Russia directly. The US will do anything it can right up until fighting Russia directly. So that means it will bleed Ukraine, it will sacrifice Ukrainians. But I don't think, as reckless as Joe Biden has been, that he actually wants to bring on World War III. So that the threat of World War III, I think, is a pretty good deterrent. The only problem here, though, is that the US keeps testing to see how far it can go. And the problem when you do that is, mistakes can happen. A missile can fire at the wrong place. Missile warning systems can pick up the wrong signs. So in a situation where you're constantly flirting with disaster, you can possibly inadvertently provoke it. So that, to me, is the main deterrent to World War III. In terms of Russia's cooperation with Iran and China militarily, I don't know enough about that to say. I don't think it's as significant as some people say it is. Certainly, Russia on its own has the capacity to blow up the world many times over. And I hope people, at least in the Pentagon, I think people in the Pentagon at least know this. And sometimes they manage to pierce through the thinking of devoted proxy warriors who are so committed to destroying Russia that they don't fully appreciate the risks of destroying the whole planet with their policies.
This is what I can't understand. Russia has the capability to wipe Ukraine off the map, and they're using a fraction of the military resources in this campaign. If the West escalates, then doesn't Russia just increase its resources to match or exceed the West, and it just goes up and up and up until it spirals into a world war? I mean, how do you see it playing out?
Well, that's been the pattern so far in the war, where basically, Russia invaded Ukraine. The, talking point is that Russia tried to take over Ukraine and it failed. If you look at how many forces it sent into Ukraine, I'm admittedly not a military expert, but I don't think Russia sent in enough to take over all of Ukraine. I think the goal was to force Ukraine militarily into the diplomacy that Ukraine refused to carry out before Russia's invasion. That's what Putin has said recently was its goal. I think there's a lot of evidence for that if you look at what it actually sent into Ukraine. There also was the fact, I think, that it may be expected an easier time, that maybe Putin was led to believe that he'd be welcomed as a liberator and that Ukrainians weren't prepared to fight him. So I think that there was that factor too. I don't want to discount that. But in terms of how this war has gone, Russia has been relatively restrained. People expected it to wipe out Ukraine within days. It didn't do that, I think, because it wanted these negotiations to work. After the negotiations failed, then Ukraine was rewarded for walking away from the Istanbul peace deal. Rewarded, I should say, in quotes, with an huge injection of weaponry. So Ukraine walks away from the Istanbul talks in April 2022. The following month, what happens? Joe Biden pushes through the first of his multi-billion-dollar military aid packages as a reward to Zelensky for walking away from peace. And that leads to a very brutal summer of fighting. But still, in the fall of September 2022, there's an article in the New York Times where anonymous U.S. officials say actually that they're baffled that Putin has avoided escalating and avoided striking civilian infrastructure. Like, they can't believe he's done this, and they can't believe this because Russia has different goals than what the U.S. does when it goes into a country. When the U.S. goes into Iraq, you have shock and awe. They immediately target all the civilian infrastructure, the sewage plants, electricity. Russia didn't do that because it actually wanted to make a peace deal, I think. But every time Ukraine and the U.S. have escalated, Russia has responded. So what is their end game? It's hard to, I don't know if they even think of that because they're so obsessed with just their immediate short-term goal of using Ukraine to bleed Russia. They've all said that's the goal. Boris Johnson, before even the war began, said that Russia must fail and must be seen to fail. Lloyd Austin, the defense secretary, said our goal is to weaken Russia. Jake Sullivan, the national security advisor, said it the Aspen Security Forum in the summer of 2022. He said that our goal is to hand Russia a strategic defeat in Ukraine and to weaken elements of its national power. I'm paraphrasing, but that's pretty much what he said. So if that's your goal and that's your obsession, you're not going to think through the consequences of your actions. And you're basically relying on Russia's restraint. That's pretty much what they're relying on. And their messaging just makes absolutely no sense, because if you listen to the arguments from people who want to escalate the war, they make two arguments simultaneously, or at least depending on the day. The one argument, which we're seeing right now, is from people who want to have these long-range strikes into Russia. And what do they say? That Putin has not responded so far to a violation of his red line, so he's soft. So we shouldn't be scared anymore of Russia's red line. Zelensky's made this argument. Russia's soft, so let's go ahead and do it. But what they also say, and Zelensky does this too, he says if we don't fight Russia and Ukraine, then Putin is going to go on and conquer not just all of Ukraine, but other parts of Europe. So simultaneously, these people claim that Russia is so soft that they're not going to strike back if we escalate. But also, if we don't escalate, Russia's going to go and conquer all of Europe. You know, it makes no sense whatsoever. But that's the kind of contradictory thinking you get trapped in when your goal is a proxy war, not the well-being of Ukraine and the rest of the world.
You think they would have learned the lessons of Hitler and Napoleon? All right, you've got another question coming on Twitter. Why did Russia in 2022 reject a Ukrainian proposed peace treaty that would have kept Ukraine out of NATO forever, while demanding that Ukraine also unilaterally disarmed if its primary reason for invading Ukraine was supposedly a possible Ukrainian NATO membership?
Well, the premise of the question is false. Russia didn't reject the peace treaty. The peace treaty was negotiated, very detailed. The New York Times recently published drafts of those documents. You can see how detailed the talks were. It was Ukraine that walked away from those talks, again, under pressure from Boris Johnson. And by the way, it's not me saying that. Everyone has said this. Ukrainian officials have said that Boris Johnson, this is where the story originates. It originates with people close to Zelensky who told a Ukrainian newspaper shortly afterwards, it was Boris Johnson that came over and said, don't make a peace deal with Russia. Let's keep fighting. A top Ukrainian negotiator, Ambassador Chali, said that we managed to reach a very real compromise in these talks. And he said Putin, quote, did everything possible to make peace. So it wasn't Putin and Russia that walked away from these talks. It was Ukraine. And if you want to argue that that's because Russia was now demanding that Ukraine unilaterally disarm, that is the claim made by people like Victoria Nuland and other proxy warriors. But you can read for yourself the document that was published in the New York Times. It lays out the demands that Russia was making, or like the proposals Russia had in terms of the size of Ukraine's military force. It's true that Russia was demanding limits on Ukraine's military force. Ukraine was open to such limits because they were negotiating them. If you read the draft document, the most recent one, I believe it's from April 15th, 2022. I believe that's the date. You can see, and the New York Times has, inside the document, you can see the two different positions of the sides. So they weren't in full agreement on what the size of Ukraine's military force would be, but they were negotiating it. And rather than try to bridge those differences that they had, it was Ukraine that walked away from the talk. So this idea that Russia walked away is false. They were negotiating it until Ukraine walked away. And Victoria Nuland recently confirmed that the U.S. Encouraged Ukraine to walk away, and she explained why. She said that it's because basically the agreement would have left Ukraine neutered as a military force. They would have put limits on the kinds of weapon systems that Ukraine could have on its territories. If Mexico or Canada were a proxy of Russia, especially after Russia backed a coup to put a new government in power, and there was a war there in which Mexico or Canada were attacking Americans inside their country, do you think the U.S. would be demanding limits on what kinds of weapon systems Mexico or Canada could host? Absolutely. If Russia tried to put weapon systems in Cuba or Venezuela now, do you think the U.S. would allow that? Of course not. So it was reasonable, I think, for Russia to demand limits on what kinds of weapon systems could be hosted in Ukraine, given that it's now a client state of the U.S. and what came to power as a result of a coup that the U.S. backed. Nuland was complaining because basically people in Washington see Ukraine as a tool that can be used to weaken Russia, and they didn't want to see Russia, by making peace with Ukraine, take away that capacity. So this idea that Ukraine would have been neutered militarily, no, it would have been neutralized as a military threat to Russia. And if you want to oppose that, and you want to basically sacrifice hundreds of thousands of Ukrainians for that goal, that's your right. It's not something that I can support, and anybody who cares about peace, I think, should support. And note also that this excuse that Nuland gave, it's different than what we got before. We've previously been told the reason Ukraine walked away is because of the alleged Russian atrocities in Bucha. That excuse never made sense because even after these alleged atrocities emerged, Zelensky went to Bucha and said, this is all the more reason why we have to keep negotiating to prevent more atrocities like this, which is fair. If you want to prevent future atrocities, the best thing you can do is reach a peace deal with the country you're accusing of committing the atrocity so that no more happen. So that excuse now is no longer being said. Bucha has just kind of been forgotten. Then we were told from some Ukrainians, okay, like we couldn't trust the Russians. All right, well, if you can't trust the Russians, why are you negotiating with them in the first place? And finally, we get this new excuse from Nuland, which I think is the most accurate because people in Washington did not want to let Ukraine live in peace, didn't want to see it neutered as a proxy. And so accordingly, we're willing to see it destroyed.
Thanks for the explanation. You got a question from Chantel. Do you really, in your heart of hearts, believe that World War III will happen and will it be nuclear?
I don't believe that, but what I believe is we should not be flirting with the possibility, which we're doing every single day, not just in Ukraine, but also in Israel-Palestine by continuing to give a green light to Israel's mass murder rampage. And we just saw a new terrorist attack by Israel in Lebanon today. So, you know, if you're asking me what my prediction is, no, I don't think we're going to see World War III, but that's just my prediction. What's happening before us is we're constantly flirting with the risk. And I don't want to have anything to do with even entertaining the possibility, which is what we're currently doing. Because again, in previous years, the US and Russia have come very close to direct nuclear confrontation. There's the Cuban Missile Crisis. There's that incident in the early 1980s where the Soviet Union misread some early warning system as being a sign of a nuclear attack. And basically because of like one person's last minute decision, we avoided a nuclear exchange. And when you have an active war zone in Ukraine between the world's top nuclear powers, and you also have incidents, you also have cases where Syria, the US is on opposing side, US and Russia are on opposing sides. You're constantly flirting with disaster. And I just don't want to be in that position.
All right. Before we get to the Israel-Palestine backstory, I'm seeing all these reports coming in today and videos of pages exploding. And I'm thinking, is this an episode of Black Mirror? I had a pager in the 1990s.
Yeah.
I mean, what is going on here?
Well, this was an operation by Israel, and I don't yet know how they carried it out. Either they had, somehow gained access to these pagers used by Hezbollah members before they were delivered to Hezbollah, or they've developed the capacity to somehow use electronic warfare to just blow up pagers. They figured that out. But in the process, they've committed a terror attack because this targeted people across the country. There have been, according to reports, more than 2,000 injured, including children. So Israel's carried out a terror attack against Hezbollah. What they're thinking, I don't know. Are they trying to trigger a war? Are they trying to basically carry out a last gasp terror attack because they actually know that a war is not coming because they don't have the US backing for one? I don't know. But it just underscores that Israel is a terror state. It's been terrorizing not just Palestine, but Lebanon for decades now. Many people forget or don't know that Israel invaded Lebanon in the early 1980s and killed tens of thousands of people, committed unspeakable crimes. And Israel has a particular focus on Lebanon because Lebanon hosts Hezbollah, and Hezbollah can actually fight back against Israel. And Israel, as a hegemon, hates people that can fight back and is obsessed with wiping them out. So this is just the latest in a long campaign against that, to carry out that goal of trying to bleed Hezbollah. And what Hezbollah will do, we'll have to wait and see.
All right. So backstory then. Mainstream media narrative here. There was the attacks on Israel last year, the rave party, etc. Piers Morgan's been covering it quite extensively. Even he was talking about the Hannibal Directive. I've watched a lot of what Norman Finkelstein has been saying. So this didn't just come out of the blue. Can you expand on that?
Well, you have to be just completely ignorant if you think that this whole thing began on October 7th, that Hamas just woke up and decided to carry out this attack on Israel because they hate Jews, and and that's their goal. I mean, which is what some people believe, but it's just completely ahistorical. Israel's running the longest running military occupation in the world. It began with it goes back many years, but just starting on a relatively modern timeline. Israel's created in 1948. Even before it's created, Zionist militias have already expelled, ethnically cleansed hundreds of thousands of Palestinians, stolen their land. Israel then in 1967 starts a new war, occupies the West Bank and Gaza, subjects the Palestinians there to a brutal military occupation, refuses all international efforts to end the occupation. Palestinians, led by the PLO, accept a really historic compromise for them. They accept a Palestinian state in just 22% of their historic homeland, the West Bank and Gaza, and sovereignty over East Jerusalem. This began, they've been talking about it for many years, but officially they accept this in 1988. Then you have the so-called peace process between Israel and the PLO. And rather than have Israel uproot its settlements in the West Bank, or colonies, if you want to be more accurate, and rather than have a genuine process that leads to a Palestinian state, Israel accelerates its theft of Palestinian land. And even when officials with Hamas, including Ismail Haniyeh, who Israel recently assassinated, even when they say we'll accept a Palestinian state in the West Bank of Gaza, Israel ignores that because Israel is a settler colonial state. It feels that has a divine right to all the land in that region, going beyond even its own, going beyond even the West Bank and Gaza, but also they see, parts of Lebanon and Syria and Jordan as theirs as well, because they also stole the Syrian Golan Heights in 1967. So Israel rejects all possible opportunities for peace. Whenever the Palestinians resist nonviolently, they get crushed. Hamas endorses in March 2018, for example, the Great March of Return, which is a nonviolent protest simply calling for an end to the Israeli blockade of Gaza and the rights of Palestinian refugees. Israel responds by deploying snipers who gun down Palestinian protesters with U.S.-made weapons. So that's the context. It's, there's so much brutality and oppression that I don't even have time to get to. And finally, this culminates on October 7th, where Hamas launches this operation. I don't think they expected to be so successful. I don't think they expected Israeli defenses to be so brittle. In the process, there are some atrocities against civilians carried out by Hamas militants. They're on camera. But Israel doesn't just stick to what actually happened. They invent all these other claims that were fake, like beheaded babies and Hamas mass rapes, to justify a mass murder campaign and to leave Gaza in ruins, because they don't want to have any Palestinians living in Gaza. They want to expel as many as possible, continuing the ethnic cleansing campaign that began in 1948. So that's my attempt at, a brief explanation of the context. There's a lot more to say.
All right, thank you. You got a question on YouTube from Dagmar. How was it possible on October 7th, Hamas entered Israel being so heavily protected, armed, and controlled, and did what they did? A lot of things don't add up. Thank you, Aaron. Love you speaking out on Palestine.
I would chalk it up to the hubris of the occupier. When you're an occupier, to justify keeping people in a concentration camp, blockading them, denying them all the basics of life, denying them even the freedom to leave, because 2 million people in Gaza were basically trapped in this concentration camp. You get a certain sense of supremacy where you see them as inferior, and it doesn't cross your mind that they would dare pull off such an operation. I know many people speculate that Israel basically let this happen because they did receive warnings about it. Personally, I don't think that was the case. I think it was just hubris from being an occupier. And also, Netanyahu had transferred soldiers to the occupied West Bank, which is Israel's top priority because the West Bank is where there's valuable water resources and other land that Israel wants to continue stealing. So I think it was hubris from being a Jewish supremacist occupier and not daring to think that these Untermenschen, these subhumans, could dare strike at our mighty military. And that also explains why you've seen such sadism by Israel ever since, because when you're an occupier premised on dispossessing and subjugating people, then when they resist you and they humiliate you, you have to just show them who's boss. And that's what Israel has been trying to do throughout its existence. In 1967, Ariel Sharon said that our main weapon is their fear of us, right? Just as a prison warden would say about the prisoners, or an abusive parent would say about, children. We have to keep them scared of us and show them who's boss. And that's what Israel's been trying to do by making Gaza uninhabitable, destroying all its civilian infrastructure, destroying homes, schools, mosques, hospitals, anything, just to show them who's in charge here.
Speaking of resources, got a question from Mark. Is it true there is oil just west of Gaza?
It is true. I don't think that's a major factor here, though. Israel can steal all the oil from Gaza that it wants. It already was doing that. So I don't think that this mass murder campaign is motivated by that. Israel can already steal Palestinians' land and resources, which it's been doing through its entire existence. So I don't think that's a major factor in what's going on. What's a major factor in what's going on is just outright supremacy and this desire to continue the ethnic cleansing that began in 1948.
So next question is from Ginger, and it is, who owns the Gaza Strip anyway?
Well, if we follow international law, the Palestinians own the Gaza Strip because it's occupied territory. Nobody recognizes Israel's right to an inch of occupied territory. But in terms of who's now legally responsible for Gaza, it's Israel, because Israel's the occupying power. Israel wants to pretend that it's no longer an occupying power in Gaza because it withdrew its settlers in 2005. But just because you withdraw from living inside the prison doesn't mean that you don't still hold the key to the prison, which is what Israel has done since 2005. And that's why they've been able to decide who can enter Gaza, who can leave, what can go into Gaza, whether chocolate sweets can be allowed into Gaza or not, how many calories people of Gaza can consume every single day. There's a line from a former Israeli official saying that we're going to put Gaza on a diet. And what he meant was there was a carefully planned out policy, which I'm sure the Nazis would be very impressed by, of how do we basically subjugate Palestinians of Gaza, keep them decimated while not having a full-blown starvation crisis. And so they calculated exactly how many calories the people of Gaza could have individually without there being a full-blown famine. And that's what they implemented. So in that situation, when you're able to calculate how many calories people can consume, that means you're occupying them. And occupiers, therefore, have legal obligations, which, of course, Israel is completely shunned.
Question from Mim. Why does Israel have an anti-Semitic law just for one nation? Why are they immune to discussions?
I don't get the question. Sorry.
Well, hasn't this been weaponized against, for example, one of the former leaders of the Labour Party here?
I see what you mean. So, like a law in like a symbolic sense. Yeah. Yeah, of course. Yeah, they weaponize anti-Semitism to undermine criticism, and that was at the heart of the scam that was used to undermine Jeremy Corbyn, the so-called anti-Semitism crisis that was used as a weapon against him. And unfortunately, too many people in the UK who should have known better bought into it. Some very prominent supporters of Jeremy Corbyn bought into it, and that helped, I think, to undermine him. And they do that everywhere. It's, in the US now, there's like a new anti-Semitism bill that basically essentially tries to criminalize protesting Israel. It's absolutely insane. And it's, as Noam Chomsky would say, it's such an insult to the memory of the victims of the Nazi Holocaust to adopt the mindset of the people that murdered them. And that's pretty much what Israel's done. Adopting the way it treats Palestinians is very similar to how the Nazis treated the Jews of Eastern Europe. And in terms of the attempt to, weaponize anti-Semitism to pursue that goal, it's such a huge insult to the memories of the Holocaust victims.
I mean, it was so transparent what they were doing to Jeremy Corbyn, but it was effective. How does it continue to be so effective?
Well, it's effective for many reasons. It's effective because people weaponize the experience of the Holocaust, which most people are very sensitive to, and don't want to be perceived to be now don't want to do anything that can get them even called an anti-Semite. So they're just exploiting this horrible genocide to silence anybody speaking out against the current genocide. And that's one way in which it's effective. Another way is that Israel is so embedded in the power establishment of the West that people understand if you're like a prominent media commentator, that if you speak out against this, you might lose a job, you might lose a column, you know, you're going to face consequences. You're going to be called names, you know, for speaking out. People who want to keep their perch don't want to go up against that. So they just either, you know, stay silent or they buy into the scam. And unfortunately, many people did.
I mean, it's devastating seeing these pictures of the kids getting carried out the rubble and stuff like that, burnt up and either dead, incinerated, or semi-alive. And Joe Spring is asking, what can everyday human beings do to help Palestine?
Well, you have to look at the context of your own life, you know, where you are, you know, what your resources are, how much time you have, and just do your best within that context. I mean, there's a different answer for everybody. Practically, there are things like the boycott, divestment, sanctions movement. You can, you know, join that and follow its guidelines. There are protests all around the world. You can join those. But it's, you know, it's hard for me to give advice like that because that's up to everyone's individual context. Everybody has different constraints on what they can do, what they're able to provide, how much time they have. So that's a question to answer for yourself.
Question from Stephen. The Jews aren't leaving and the Palestinians don't want a two-state solution. So what is the answer?
Well, ideally, the answer is just democracy, where everybody has the same equal rights. I mean, we don't accept apartheid in South Africa. Why should we accept apartheid in Israel? And in fact, the comparison is not fair because, as Chomsky would say, what Israel has done to the Palestinians is far worse than apartheid. So why should we accept far worse than apartheid in Israel-Palestine? The idea that Palestinians don't want a two-state solution, you know, listen, maybe at this point now they don't anymore, because how could you accept living next to this genocidal, psychotic state full of people who celebrate the murder of Palestinian children? So I can't fault the Palestinian for not wanting a two-state solution. But historically, this claim that Palestinians don't want a two-state solution is not true. The Palestinian leadership accepted a two-state solution. First, the PLO did, then members of Hamas did. And rather than pursue those diplomatic openings, Israel, backed by the US, undermined them. So what is the answer now? What is the answer? The real question is, what is the answer when you have a supremacist, psychotic state with nuclear weapons? That's the question to ask. Not about what Palestinians can do or can't do, because they're the victims here. They're occupied. What do we do with this insane state that constantly threatens everybody and massacres Palestinians constantly? What is the answer? I don't know. I don't have an answer, but we can start with not supporting it, which is what the West is doing. The U.S. is instrumental to Israel's occupation, to its genocide in Gaza. So the answer starts with stopping arming this threat to the planet and using the leverage we have to bring about some sort of equitable solution. Whatever is possible now, I don't know. But it starts with not participating in the criminal behavior of this regime.
And worst case scenario, is this conflict another trajectory to nuclear war if Netanyahu gets Iran involved and it escalates with Russia, China, and America in that region?
Yeah, of course, worst case scenario it is. Yes, Israel does have nukes. Are they crazy enough to use them? There are people. Yes, there are people inside Israel that are. I mean, look at Netanyahu and his cabinet. Totally off the deep end when it comes to fanaticism. Israel's always been a fanatical state that sees itself as superior, has the right to steal Arab land, to threaten its neighbors, to invade them, to massacre people. But the current leadership is at the most extreme end of that already really extreme spectrum. So yes, if this continues, we are on that path, and it's all the more reason to get off it.
So we talked about Jeremy Corbyn and how transparent that was. Look at Hillary Clinton, Russiagate, how transparent that was, and yet she's still pushing it. What are your thoughts on Hillary Clinton?
Well, I've always thought that the anti-Semitism scam and Russiagate were very similar. Both were propaganda campaigns by neoliberal elites to cement their hold on power and to undermine things like a genuine anti-war movement, which is what Jeremy Corbyn represented, and also what could have happened in the US had the Democrats learned the lessons of 2016, in which they lost to Trump pretending to be anti-war. And Democrats could have said, why don't we put forward a genuine anti-war candidate like Bernie Sanders, who almost won against Hillary Clinton and who many Trump supporters would have actually voted for. So both were scams and that were aimed at deceiving people into propping up the same militarism and the same support for Israel and the same neoliberal policies that so many people were fed up by in both countries. You know, in Britain, I think being fed up with neoliberalism was a factor in Brexit, certainly was a factor in Jeremy Corbyn's ascent. And same with Trump. Trump pretended to be an anti-establishment candidate who would drain the swamp. So here in the US and UK, you had two genuine opportunities for a real, genuine progressive movement that was rooted in being anti-war and populist and having economic policies that served the many, not the few. And both scams were used to undermine prospects for that. Hillary Clinton is still holding on to it because she's still bitter about losing to Trump. That was pretty humiliating for her. And because there have been no consequences. There are no consequences for literally funding one of the biggest and most destructive disinformation campaigns in history, which is Russiagate. Russiagate originates with her campaign. Her campaign funded the Steele dossier, which spread the lie about Trump-Russia collusion. It also paid for the firm CrowdStrike, which first accused Russia of stealing Democratic Party emails. And that set off the whole Russian interference allegation. So the Clinton campaign is at the heart of the two foundational allegations that drove Russiagate, and there'd be no consequences for it whatsoever. Even when CrowdStrike admitted under oath that actually, by the way, even though we publicly accused Russia of stealing those emails, we actually had no evidence for it. Even when they admitted under oath, that testimony was kept under wraps for nearly 3 years before the public was allowed to see it. And of course, we know the Steele dossier, which Hillary Clinton funded, was a complete scam. There's no need to even go into that. There have been no consequences for it. And there have been no consequences because the national security state was complicit in this Clinton campaign scam. And some people really are too big to fail and too big to be held accountable. And so therefore, when you had this investigation by John Durham, who was appointed under Trump to investigate the origins of Russiagate, he put out a report that, yeah, it was critical of the FBI for relying on the Steele dossier, but did not go anywhere nearly far enough in holding the people to account. He didn't even touch the CrowdStrike thing because I think there was a recognition that that allegation was too important to this narrative that we need to demonize Russia and criminalize diplomacy with it. And you do not challenge these core allegations, just like you don't challenge the allegations of Syria using chemical weapons against its own people, which I've done based on leaks that show a cover-up at the OPCW. To illustrate how foundational that allegation is to, narratives required to wage U.S. foreign policy and justify war against Syria. If you look at corporate media in the U.S., try to find even a story that acknowledges the existence of the OPCW leaks and the OPCW whistleblowers. They're such a threat to the narrative that they're not even allowed to exist. So stories about Syria chemical weapons pretty much always, without exception, omit the fact that whistleblowers within the OPCW, the world's top chemical weapons watchdog, to investigate allegations of Syrian chemical weapons use in April 2018, they don't even mention that these whistleblowers exist. It's out of 1984. They're basically vetoed from history. They're memory hold. So some allegations and some countervailing evidence, it's just too big. Some countervailing evidence is just, it's too damning to even be acknowledged because people need to be sufficiently propagandized to go along with believing these narratives so that they can support things like wars and sanctions against enemy states.
Yeah, brought to you by the same mainstream media told us Saddam had weapons of mass destruction. And
Exactly.
you are so right.
Yeah, exactly. And listen, on the point about CrowdStrike, try to find an acknowledgement in U.S. media across the spectrum that CrowdStrike, again, which is hired by the Hillary Clinton campaign, its forensics were relied on by the FBI to accuse Russia of this foundational, consequential allegation that Russia stole Democratic Party emails and gave them to WikiLeaks. Try to find a mention in corporate U.S. media that CrowdStrike's president admitted under oath that actually they had no evidence of Russian hacking. That also is memory hold because it's too damning to the narrative that was used for this propaganda campaign.
Yeah, when there's no consequences, the Clinton crime family will do what the hell they like or kill who the hell they like. Look at Jeffrey Epstein. All right, we're down to our last 5 minutes, folks. If you've got any questions, get them in the chat now, please. We're here with Aaron Maté, and his links are in the description box below this video if you want to support his important work. He's very active on Twitter. He's got a video of Hillary on his Twitter right now talking about arresting people for social media posts, just like we're seeing here in the UK. All right, we've got a question from JC Angel. What do you think there could be a possible false flag event to initiate World War III? Do you see any other trajectory scenarios outside of what we've discussed?
I'm not in the business of predicting false flags. I'm in the business of debunking the false flags that we know about, like, for example, in Syria, for which there's plenty of evidence, but I'm not one to predict false flags. But certainly, given that there is a history of them, it's fair to worry about one occurring. But yeah, it's not for me to predict. Certainly, what I know is the story that I've covered extensively in Duma, April 2018, where Syria is accused of a chemical attack, and then the Trump administration bombed Syria in purported retaliation. I'm very confident saying that that was a false flag based on the evidence that was suppressed by the OPCW, but which came out via leaks from that organization. That to me is a very clear case of it, but future ones, I'm not going to predict. And about Hillary Clinton, it's important to stress what she was talking about. She said on the Rachel Maddow show, like the leading purveyor of Russiagate propaganda, she said that Americans who spread propaganda should face criminal charges. Well, if that law, or if her proposal was applied, she'd be the first one to be charged because she funded one of the most consequential propaganda campaigns in U.S. history, which is Russiagate. So the entitlement, the hubris that she gets in calling for criminalizing something that she is guilty of, it speaks to how there's no accountability in our society for Western elites. They're just, they get away with everything.
All right, there's a plethora of questions coming about the second Trump assassination, so we'll finish with that. I mean, when I saw this news come in, I was wondering, 2 months after assassination attempt 1, why is he being paraded around a routine golf course? You think he would be going from bunker to bunker in a Pope-mobile after that, but it seems there's some lax judgment. What are your thoughts?
He clearly loves golf. That does seem to be a strong passion of his. And yeah, listen, this is another major security failure, and there's all sorts of questions to ask. I understand why Trump supporters are extremely skeptical of what happened here. I personally cannot believe that the Secret Service would knowingly endanger Trump, or there was some sort of conspiracy here. I just think something like that is to pull off is just too. There's no way to pull that off. I just don't think there is. But I understand that given that there's been 2 assassination attempts in about as many months, I understand why people are raising questions. And what's interesting about this would-be shooter is that he was in Ukraine and claiming to be a recruiter of international fighters for Ukraine. Now, it appears as if that was a lot of hot air, that he actually wasn't the recruiter that he said he was. But the fact that he was in Ukraine and the fact that he's now caught trying to kill Trump, it speaks to, another reason why we shouldn't be having these proxy wars. They attract unstable people. They fuel militarism. And what if it turns out that he was trying to kill Trump because he perceives Trump to be a threat to the Ukraine war, which is what we're told Trump is. Now, I don't know if Trump actually is a threat to the Ukraine war. He did talk about in the debate that we have to end the war. But in office, Trump actually did a lot to, I think, make sure that this war happened. His policies contributed, I think, to the climate we're in today. So who knows? But certainly there's a perception that he's a threat to the Ukraine war. And what if this guy was motivated by that, by trying to basically take out someone who he thought would impose peace on Ukraine and Russia? And it underscores that we shouldn't be engaged in these proxy wars that attract unstable characters and that encourage violence. But that's the path that we've chosen. And the dangers, unfortunately, extend far beyond, this one assassination attempt, but literally, as we've talked about, to the threat of World War III. It's something to take very seriously.
Thanks for coming on, man. I'm fascinated by these geopolitical subjects, and you give such well-researched and articulate answers, and we appreciate the work you're doing. So good luck. Thank you.
Thanks for having me, Sean. Good to meet you.
All right. Cheers. All right. So like I said, Aaron's links are in the description box below this video. He's very active on Twitter. You can go over there and follow him and check his work out. And just to give the usual disclaimer, we have a variety of viewpoints on this channel. We are going to go increasingly down the road of the war subject because it's something that can absolutely affect everyone. look at the likes of Boris Johnson and Keir Starmer trying to escalate, and you've got the youth of Ukraine, hundreds of thousands, especially the young men. See the videos of them getting dragged to the front line. That blood is on their hands as far as I'm concerned. And these psychopaths do not lose a scintilla of sleep at nights. So we need to keep raising awareness about this stuff. I've learned so much from speaking to Aaron tonight. You know, I read a lot about World War One, World War Two, when I was in my reading phase in Arizona. But to get all the details and put it into a contemporary context, I really got passion for this subject. So we're going to try and get more guests on to discuss these scenarios. And huge thank you, guys, for all of your questions that have come in. And if you missed my live stream from 2 hours ago with Marilyn, she destroyed Hugh Edwards and his poxy sentence of not getting any prison time. If you missed Marilyn, she was on fire for an hour. Stay tuned because this video is going to customize right over to it. And if it doesn't, I suggest you find it because it's the first time she was on the channel and she is a well-wicked spiritual warrior. All right, we hope to be back tomorrow with more content.